Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really glad that you can be here for our webinar on attribution. My name is Sarah Moked, and I'm joined by Rachel Whitlack as moderators for today's session. We're really excited about today's webinar. The goal is basically just to share some recent research about attribution and talk about the different solutions that Google offers. And we have two speakers today. Stefan Tornquist, who is the VP of Research at eConsultancy, will be speaking first, followed by Bill Key, who's our product manager here at Google for attribution and multi-channel measurement. We'll have a couple of chances for Q&A during the webinar. You can feel free to type in your questions at any time using the little window on your console, and we'll do our best to respond to as many questions as we can. And finally, the webinar will be recorded, and you'll be receiving a link in a few days. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Stefan Tornquist of eConsultancy.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and hello, everyone. Let's move through the agenda slides. Hang on one second. All right. So what I'm going to be spending the first little piece of this webinar talking about is a piece of research that we conducted in late 2011, the very beginning of this year, comprised of two pieces. The first was a survey of marketers, analytics pros, both on the client side and the agency side, about their use of attribution or their non-use of attribution. This was intentionally skewed towards towards organizations who are practicing attribution at some level. So when you see 2/3 using attribution, that by no means does that mean 66% of the marketing industry is using attribution. That's our sample. Predominantly from the US with a solid chunk from the UK. And one thing that I thought made this research particularly interesting, certainly interesting for me, was that we included a phase of interviews. So I had the opportunity to speak with people at a variety of organizations, all of those in North America, who are doing attribution, some of them at a very high level, some of them for quite a long time by the standards of the practice. So that phase to me provided some of the most interesting bits of insight and made the technology, the practice of attribution, which is quite heady and can be quite complicated, brought it into reality for me, seeing how organizations are using it, the kinds of lessons they're learning, et cetera. So with that, let's take a look at some of our top-line findings. But let's start with an example of one of the quotes that you'll find in the white paper, in the report that is available for free through Google. We've been working on client attribution long enough to know that a lot of our general assumptions are sometimes dead wrong. So that is really attribution at its best. That's analytics at its best, when it's taking something that you take for granted, taking a piece of conventional wisdom, and saying, you know what, that's not really that's not the reality, at least in this case. So that is the goal for a lot of organizations, but the primary goal, and that's what we're looking at here, is to justify digital spending. That's not necessarily the primary benefit. We'll talk about those in a minute. But it's interesting that that primary goal actually gets away from the functioning of marketing and sort of speaks to how does marketing communicate with the rest of the organization? How does the digital marketing group, if it's independent, how does it justify what it's doing? Political issues are among the most important in the enterprise, and we're going to be talking about some of the politics related to attribution before we're done today. But as we move down through those other goals, we start to get into the nitty-gritty of how marketing works. Creating more effective media mix, understanding the funnel, understanding the sales cycle, and at the bottom, and this is of great interest to some, less interest to others, is really determining how to work deals with affiliates. So that one is, for those involved in e-commerce, it's a big question and an important one. But I know that most of our listeners may not, this may not be your bailiwick. I encourage those of you who are interested on the affiliate side to download the report, and of course, you're more than welcome to ask questions on that topic for later on in the webinar. So these are the benefits of attribution. So these are the people who are the organizations that are doing attribution. What are they getting from it? And the primary benefit, certainly among the top goals, better ability to allocate budget, and as a result, ROI is improved. That's exactly what you would want out of attribution, and it is what people get. Now, I'm using the term attribution in a very general way. We'll talk about different methodologies for attribution later in my portion and certainly in Bill's portion. Moving down this line, better understanding how the digital channels work together, I mean, that is the essence of attribution. Attribution doesn't really measure the success of individual channels, at least not at the top level of the practice. What it looks at is what channels are contributing to the customer journey. And as that research gets conducted, then marketers get to see what's happening in the middle of the funnel. You know, we're typically, even whether we're doing attribution or not, we typically have a fairly good idea about what's happening at the top of the funnel, spend a lot of time with the bottom of the funnel, and it's the middle that is a mystery. And to my way of thinking, one of the most interesting and beneficial pieces of attribution is exploring how those different, for lack of a better word, influencer channels, the helper channels, how they play a role. And what happens when you remove them, what happens when you spend more on them. And that sort of plays into the third of these benefits, which is providing insights into the audience. Who is the audience? What are their behaviors like? If you're only seeing them as they come into the top of the funnel or as they're spit out the bottom, you're missing a lot of how they interact with your media. What kinds of user-generated content are they considering? Are they producing? And of course, they're going to be customer types as well, and those different types are going to use different media at different points in the customer journey. And when I say the customer journey, another broad term, basically from that moment of awareness of your product through the initial conversion and then hopefully retention of that customer. What are the different the paths that customers take between that start and end point? What we know about the customer journey is that it's only getting more complex as people are using different research tools to discover products, to compare products, to look for optimal pricing, et cetera. Now, getting down to the fourth of these benefits, this sort of ties into that primary goal of we want to be able to justify digital spending in general. 54% saying this is positioning us better to communicate the benefits of particular channels to obtain budget. It's more accountable. Accountability is a word that's used so often in marketing that it begins to lose a bit of its meaning. But without question, there are those interactions between finance and marketing, and indeed different parts of marketing itself, where that ability to show the accountability of marketing is paramount. Finally, and this only applies to some organizations, the better understanding of online and offline media interactions. That's a topic for an entirely different webinar, but certainly that's where that is the big gap in that remains. Figuring out effective, fast ways of determining how offline, say, branding campaigns are plugging into where people convert online and in the other direction. And undoubtedly, we'll be seeing a lot of innovation in that area. So this is not an exhaustive list of the different ways of conducting attribution, but it probably captures the major ways. I'm sure everyone out there is familiar with the most common of these. Last click, first click are you put those together and you've got much of the existing marketplace. As you might imagine, if you've got a complex set of interactions that are part of the customer journey, and you're only looking at one slice at the beginning or the end, that gives you limited information, and it's going to inflate or deflate the value of some channels. And I know that Bill's going to be addressing that with some hard numbers later on. So last click is by far the most common, both with agencies and on the client side. What we found, because we asked our respondents who are using attribution how long they had been in the practice, and for many it's quite a recent development. But when we look at those who have been doing it for more time, and those who, larger organizations that have been spending a bit more on analytics, we see a migration away from the sort of single view tactics of last and first click towards some more sophisticated methods. There's an element of customization there as you learn from attribution experiments, starting to distribute credit to different channels, sort of fine-tuning the algorithm. Then there are also those who do a linear model, which says basically, we know that everything contributes. It's very difficult to know how much, so we're not going to rob the middle of the funnel for the benefit of the beginning or the end, and we're going to give everything sort of equal attribution. That reflects a certain holistic view, certainly, but also is naturally not going to really distribute credit very accurately. So looking at how the users tend to view their methodologies, kind of reflecting what we were just talking about, last click gets the lowest scores. Customized by channel and unique methodology, those are going to get the highest scores. Not surprising there. And again, we do see over time a migration once organizations engage with attribution as a practice and a body of knowledge and a set of technologies, because it really is all three of those things. Over time, they're going to do one of two things. Either they're going to stop doing it because they're not seeing the benefit, or they're not in a position to take advantage, or, and this appears to be more likely, they're going to engage with attribution at a deeper level, and that means moving away from one of these sort of simple views. Now, this is a slide that I want you to be careful of, because it's easy to look at this slide and say, well, here's the benefit of hundreds of organizations and how they view channels, and I'm just going to piggyback on what they've found. Regrettably, attribution doesn't work that way, and what we do know is that you've got some very unique patterns that associated with different companies. So while it's easy to look at this and say, all the numbers of organizations who are investing in print is very small, or investing more in print, rather. So those who are investing more in print is very small. We see that on the right side of the slide, versus something like online display, which is really benefiting, as well as paid search and SEO on the left side of our screen. That doesn't tell us the whole story, because it's not at the company level. It's like asking the person next to you at a conference what their conversion rate is. Nominally interesting, but absolutely not germane to what you do unless you happen to be a direct competitor of the same size. So just because the channels are scoring differently, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily going to be your experience. In the interviews, one of the most interesting subtexts was talking to those organizations who are knocking it out of the park with email, which scores pretty well across the board, but is not the sexiest channel out there. And by the same token, online display, which has some fans, but certainly detractors as well. And there's some big open questions about the efficacy of online branding, et cetera. What's really fascinating is talking to organizations that have taken the online display portion out of their marketing and watched their attribution model, watched what that does to something like their cost of customer acquisition in paid search, for example. So they've taken away the branding, and they've seen what happens, the skyrocketing cost of a conversion. One other thing about this chart, this looks at the percentage of organizations saying we're going to spend more, we're going to spend less. This is not a weighted chart. So our 2% that are spending more on direct mail might be several dozen of the largest companies in the country. We don't know that, and so I don't want you to think that this necessarily reflects dollar figures to these various channels. This is, we use TV, we're spending more on TV. All right. So with that, I wanted to end up with a couple of slides on what it takes to be successful with attribution, and we'll be talking about, or Bill will be talking about, some of the technical aspects of it. I wanted to leave you with some of the sort of real-world marketing department aspects. My favorite quote from this report is this one. The elephant in the room is that attribution will affect how people are compensated. So you have to deal with those politics, or you're not going to get buy-in, you're going to get resistance. And an example of that would be, many organizations are going to pay into bonus based on the media spend in a given channel. And so if you come in and let's say you're using a first-click analysis, and so that really benefits some of the branding tools, say online display, well, then that group that spends a lot of money generating branding isn't going to necessarily look at a campaign that starts spreading the credit down through the funnel. They're not going to necessarily look at that as a positive. So you've got to get in front of that, anticipate those problems. I mean, it's going to be quite evident where those issues might arise, and it's absolutely something that you need to get in front of. And that kind of ties in, this is my last slide, with the keys to success. And the irony here is that these keys to success could very well apply outside of attribution. They could apply to automation, even analytics in general, right? That every year, every 6 months, marketers have a new technology and to decide, is this going to be a benefit to us? And they've got to address these same issues. Structure and compensation we talked about. Coming from that, or adjacent to that, is the support of management. Simply buying a piece of technology isn't going to be of benefit unless you do these other things, all of which are going to take a very strong leadership position from someone highly placed in the organization, or preferably the whole leadership team. Because if you're going to make sure that your data is solid, there's going to be money and time spent there. That means staffing that's appropriate to the technology. I think Avinash's sort of rule of thumb of 90-10 or 80-20. I'm spacing it right now. I think that's about right. You shouldn't be spending most of your money on technology. It's going to be on the people. As big data is upon us, data is more and more ragged. It's not fitting into CRM fields nearly as neatly as it used to, and the bigger it gets, the less that's going to be true. You need people who are able to take data, make it into information, and then find insight. And then, of course, the technology runs through all of these different practices, and certainly through attribution. There are some organizations who are still using Excel. You can. It's hard, and there are limitations to what you can do. That being said, there are organizations who are doing it successfully. Happily, the technology for this is coming in at every level of the market. I think that it's now readily available in the mid-market and to a certain extent across the whole analytics suite. And we're going to see people getting more sophisticated all the time, and the features of that technology reflecting that sophistication. So that is my piece. I think we're going to take a couple of questions now, and that'll be pretty quick. And then, of course, after Bill's section, we'll be taking some more.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stefan. That was really great. I'm just going to take a look here and see what questions have come in. So we've got one question here. An audience member wants to know if doing last-click attribution is better than not doing attribution at all.
It's a good question because on the one hand you could take the point of view that last click is going to give you an inherently stilted view, and there's nothing worse than stilted data because it has the power of a number behind it, and yet it's wrong, or at least incomplete. I would take, I think, a second angle at that, which is to say, because we've seen this migration from, we're doing last click early on, and then we migrate towards something more sophisticated, or we continue with last click, but we start assigning, different channels with different amounts of credit based on our experience, because you have to get started somewhere. And because getting started means sort of changing your perspective on how the channels interrelate, acknowledging that they do, and that it isn't all about one channel. Even though that view might be limited, I would say it's better to do last click, learn what you can, and move on from there, than not to engage at all. Bill, you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that. The thing I would add to that is that there are different forms of last click attribution as well. One of the common things we will often see is siloing of attribution by channel, right? So you might be measuring your conversions for your search advertising with one system. You might be measuring display with another system, and you might be measuring affiliates with a third. In which case, if you're doing last click attribution, you may be taking a single conversion or a single purchase and actually double or triple counting it. And that can make reconciling the numbers and understanding what's really going on very difficult. So in many ways, one of the first steps of attribution is actually getting that cross-channel view. So even if you're looking at last click, you're at least getting a perspective on what the actual last click is, as opposed to potentially duplicating your data and really not having an understanding of what's going on. So there's a lot of benefit just even in that practice.
Fair enough. Are we going to do one more before moving on, or are we running long?
One more, and then we'll turn over to Bill, and then we'll have more time for Q&A at the end. So another question that just came in here is, where do you see the biggest shortcomings for first touch attribution for e-commerce sites with a very short buying cycle?
Oh, that's interesting. Keeping in mind that I am not a practitioner, and Bill will give an infinitely more nuanced answer to this, it would seem to me that, yes, there are those e-commerce purchases where you're going to see either a fast conversion and maybe not even a second visit, I guess is the implication here. So first click is certainly going to be valuable there. I would say going beyond that is going to answer a few other questions, like, is that really what's happening? Is that paid search click, for example, really all that they're interacting with? One thing that we see across pretty much every product category is that people are researching what seem to be the most minute purchases more and more. And they might be researching in a place that you can affect with your marketing. They might not. So I think any sort of deeper attribution is going to be valuable to you, but that is absolutely a case where if you've only got one or two interactions, then your first click and your last click, it's kind of the same thing. I think those sorts of purchases are getting increasingly rare, but they certainly exist, and you're absolutely better off looking at how the mix is working than not.
I would just add to that, if you find in analyzing your data that you have such short paths, right? If 90+% of your purchases come from someone visiting once and either converting or not converting and moving on, then I sort of think there's two different takeaways you could take from that. One is that maybe you don't really have an attribution problem, right? And and your time is better spent elsewhere in analyzing your data. The second is that perhaps you are so fully invested in marketing tactics that are focused only on the bottom of the funnel that you're not actually engaging customers who may not find you otherwise. So that could also be a takeaway. I think the data that you see is a reflection of not just what your customers are doing, but what your actual marketing strategy is. So you should use that as an evaluation of, is my marketing strategy actually targeting customers where I want to target them?
Okay, great. Thanks so much, guys. I think we're going to now turn it over to Bill and let him give his portion of the presentation, and then we'll have another chance for Q&A after that.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Stefan, as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think about attribution here at Google, both at a conceptual level and then specifically about some of the product offerings that we have that can help you get started. So just to kind of level set on what we're thinking about when and what I'm going to be talking about when I talk about online attribution. You know, most customers today are measuring a conversion of one kind or another, and if you're not, that's obviously an important place to get started. So if you measure in this example a transaction that takes place that is worth $100 to you, you'll look back at what marketing channel drove that, and you'll assign, in this case, if it were email, $100 of credit to email. What we're beginning to see as customers get better data available to them is that the story is more complex than that. And you can see that a customer may have multiple interactions across multiple channels prior to converting, and suddenly that $100 assignment to email may not make sense. So that's what the practice of attribution modeling is really about, is saying how do we distribute credit for that. So one approach, as Stefan was mentioning earlier, could be, well, I just give equal credit to all of them. In this case, there were 5 interactions, so maybe they all get $20 worth of credit. Or maybe there's something special about the first interaction and the last interaction, so that's how I'm going to divide up credit there. And you can quickly see how the number of permutations across this can become quite complex, and I think that's one of the things that marketers are wrestling with today. So there's so many factors to consider. The position, was it the first, the middle, or the last? What is the time from conversion? That's actually a very important consideration. Was the first interaction 2 days before conversion or 20 days before conversion? The time between interactions, if you have 5 clicks within a 2-hour period versus 5 clicks spread over 5 days, that's a very different experience for your customer, and it means something very different in terms of the marketing interaction you're having with them. And then you can think beyond that. What is the type of interaction that you're having? Is it a display impression or a rich media interaction? Is somebody clicking through to your site? What was the creative that they saw? What landing page did they experience? Even before they convert, you might have some metrics around how much they engaged with your site. Did they visit a lot of pages, spend a lot of time? And did they complete micro-conversions along the way? Each of these things could be factored into understanding, as customers have these different touch points, how is that actually affecting their likelihood to convert over time, and thus indicating the efficacy of those different marketing touches. But then it gets even more complicated than that. So you can think about all the things that are going on outside of this world that you're tracking online, right? So you may be doing television advertising. You may be launching products or changing your pricing in ways that dramatically change this behavior that may have nothing to do with the actual online marketing you're doing. And then there are things beyond your control, like seasonality, what your brand level of awareness is compared to competitors, things that competitors do. So all of these types of things begin to make this problem incredibly complex, and this is where we often find marketers getting hung up, where when you really begin to think about how complex this problem is, it doesn't seem like there's any path forward. And that's one of the reasons why models such as the last click are prevalent today, because while it is flawed and people recognize that, it is simple, and it's something that has been accepted and can more or less be agreed on. So rather than dive into the complexity, it's easier to stick with that simplicity. And I think for a lot of customers, it's not a bad start, as we were mentioning earlier, particularly if you can do it across channels. It does show that there's a strong correlation between what marketing channel they interacted with and then an immediate conversion. But I think from what we've seen in the research and the customers who have started to engage beyond the last click, there's a lot of benefit to be gained. The efficiency that's there is great, and so we need to find some middle way between looking at a perfect solution and beginning to move away from a highly imperfect one. So there's a few things that I'm going to talk about that I think you can get started on conceptually when thinking about this to begin to look beyond the last click. So the first is not necessarily even starting with that problem of how do we distribute credit, but just getting an understanding of what your online marketing funnel looks like. So many customers don't actually have insight into this data, or if they do, they haven't done a lot of analysis on it. So there are things that you can do to understand how much time is taking place between when you first interact with a customer and when they purchase. That's something that you can actually find out in your data and can inform everything from what types of marketing channels you choose to use to just having a better notion of your customer's persona. And of course, this can vary based on different customer segments. So doing that is very, very important. Similarly with understanding how many touches they're having. And then beginning to break down what types of marketing interactions are playing these different roles across being an introducer, being a supporter in the funnel, and being a closer. All of that is going to help you get a much better understanding of your customer and how you interact with them, which should be one of the core practices of marketing anyway. So this is really, really close to the customer, and that's what makes it valuable. Another thing to consider with this, and this gets back a little bit to the question we had earlier about, what if I only have very short paths, is what goals are you considering, right? So if you're an e-commerce company, you might have a very clear goal around having transactions. But there are lots and lots of other types of conversions. So, for instance, you may have a simple lead form. And that lead form you may find primarily has closers, primarily has 1 or 2 touch points before conversion. So it's important to look at a goal like that compared to, say, a broader goal, say like an expensive travel purchase, where there may be a lot of research involved across multiple channels over time. So it's really important to understand not just what the marketing channels are doing, but what goal or conversion it is that you're looking at. And this can even have variation within e-commerce transactions. So how do your different types of products behave? Are less expensive products or products of a certain type selling according to a different pattern? And attribution may ultimately be very different for all of those. So those are things to consider and can help you understand ultimately how your customers end up finding out about your products and making decisions about them. So going through this process, and I'll talk a little bit later about how you can do some of this with Google's tools today, going through this process up to this point allows you to get that sense of what your customers are doing. The next step is to really form some hypotheses about this that you can then begin to test and begin to look at through an attribution modeling practice. So when you look at this data and you see perhaps that there are many touch points prior to conversion, you can form some hypotheses about this. So these could be as simple as that early touches generate later actions, that display impressions influence clicks, or that social interactions earlier in the funnel drive awareness. So this notion of being able to form some hypotheses about that upper funnel behavior can begin to help you generate some of the models that you would actually end up applying. Similarly, the way I like to think about this is that there's also some lower funnel hypotheses that you can take into account. A lot of what I hear marketers say about the last click isn't necessarily just that it doesn't take into account the entire customer journey, but that it basically misassigns attribution to behaviors that are really navigational in nature, right? So somebody may find out about you through a display advertisement or through a search ad, but then may visit your site directly later. And is that direct visit really the interaction that drove the conversion or not, or is it just part of the navigation process that follows a marketing interaction? There's a similar behavior with branded versus generic searches. So a customer may not know about your product or category in advance, or that you're offering a particular service in an area. So they might search generally about for instance, shoes or a general product like that, but then end up following up and searching for your particular brand after they've done their research. So correcting for behavior like that, even in your last click model, can be helpful. And there's a similar problem with that around affiliates that I think is, as Stefan mentioned earlier, is one of the areas that customers really focus on with attribution, because it is so tied to giving very specific credit for a conversion. So these are some of the types of hypotheses that you can begin to form. And then where we see that going is translating those hypotheses into attribution models, right? So this is an example of some of the types of general models that you can think of and how they tie back to hypotheses. So you could take that first click model, and what that's going to tell you is which channels are doing that introducing, right? So if your hypothesis is that those earlier actions are really the ones that generate the later behavior, you can apply that model and see how the data looks. Similarly, there's of course the last click model that you may be using today that you can use as a point of comparison. The linear model that we were speaking about earlier, where you can give credit throughout the entire path, this is going to help you get an idea of what types of channels are providing that support throughout the entire process, right? So comparing that to first and last can really give you a sense of how different channels are behaving. You can take into account things like time. So I think this is a very powerful model where you can begin to credit those interactions that happen closer to the time of conversion than those further away. So there may be a lot of interactions that take place close to the end of a conversion cycle that you want to concentrate the credit around. And this can give you a picture of, what are those channels that really help the customer make that end decision. And then finally, we have you can look at a position-based model, and this is just another example of how you could apply those assumptions around the first interaction being important, middle interactions perhaps being less important, and the last interaction being more. And I think the key here is really not about looking at any of these models at the beginning as being the right way of evaluating your marketing, but instead that they each give you a different perspective on how your marketing is functioning. And you can compare those outcomes, and that can give you a lot of insights. So for instance, you could look at how, and what I'm showing here is actually a series of different high-level channels and how they are valued compared to a last-click model. So this is just hypothetical data, but it's based on the type of thing that we typically see. So you might see that when you take a linear model, a position-based model, and a custom-weighted model, and apply those and compare them to a last-click model, you'll see that some channels perhaps are valued more highly under all of the models. Some may be valued more highly, in the example of branded search, under some models than under others. And this can begin to give you some insight into those channels that may be performing poorly under all alternative models, and those that are performing highly under multiple alternative models. And that can really help you give direction around what are the types of things that you want to begin experimenting with and moving forward with. So this is that notion of really making this a comparative process, I think, is really, really key. And it helps move away from that notion of having to find the perfect model that takes into account all of the complexity that's involved. So I'm going to shift now to talk about how you can do some of this with Google's tools today. So there's actually a range of options, and it kind of depends on what it is, the place that you're at, and what products you're using today. So there's three that I'm going to talk about. The first is a product called Search Funnels in AdWords, and this has been available for a while now. And I'll talk in detail about that, and it really gives you insight into search and how you can look at attribution there. We then have a solution in Google Analytics that's available to everyone called multi-channel funnels. It's very similar to search funnels, but it gives you a cross-channel view. And then finally, we also have an attribution modeling tool in Google Analytics Premium that's very new that I'll give a demo of in a little bit to give you an idea of what's available there. So search funnels in AdWords. If you're using AdWords today and you're using conversion tracking in AdWords, this is a very, very powerful tool that you can just begin accessing immediately. It gives you the ability to see not just the last click prior to conversion, but all of the search clicks and search impressions that occurred prior to that conversion. So you can understand what channels are, or what types of keywords and what types of interactions are more upper funnel and what might be lower down in the funnel. This can be really helpful for evaluating the interplay between generic and branded keywords. We see that there's a large percentage of conversions where the last click is a branded keyword that actually has a prior click or impression from a generic keyword. And you can really then begin to understand what the interaction between those two is and form some experiments around it. And like I said, this works with AdWords conversion tracking, so it's kind of available out of the box if you're doing that today. So we highly recommend looking at that. Where you can find it, just so that it's easy for you to find, if you go into your AdWords interface, it's in the conversions section, and then you can go into the left nav of that conversion section, and you'll see search funnels right there. You can click on it and begin to see which types of keywords are doing that assisting I was referring to. So that's search funnels. When you then want to go beyond that and begin to look at a cross-channel point of view to see how search, organic search, display, affiliates, social, and other channels work together, we have a solution today in Google Analytics called multi-channel funnels. And basically what this allows you to do is take the conversions that you're measuring already in Google Analytics and see that path going back. And this is really, really powerful if you're a Google Analytics user already. What you're able to see with these reports, there's 5 reports, and I'm actually going to give a demo in a moment so you can see specifically what you can do with them. But at a high level, you can begin to get insight into your funnel. So you can get a sense of how long is it taking customers to convert with a time lag report from that first interaction through the time that they convert. How many interactions are they having prior to converting? All of that is readily available. The top paths report will let you dig in and see what were the actual sequences that users followed prior to converting. And then what I think is the most powerful report is what we call the assisted conversions report. And this allows you to see not just those channels that had a last interaction prior to conversion, but all of the touches, all of those channels that were assisting prior to conversion, so that you can really begin to do some of that comparison I was talking about. In terms of where you can find this, if you go into Google Analytics and you go into your standard reporting, it's in the conversion section on the left, and you can see the reports there. I'll walk through a demonstration of some of the things you can do with that. The last piece that I'll talk about before jumping into the demo is the new attribution modeling tool we have in Google Analytics. And this is in the premium version of Google Analytics. So with this tool, you're able to take your baseline model, which for many customers would be a last interaction model, and quickly compare that to up to 3 other models. So you're able to pick some of the examples I was giving before, a linear model, a time decay model, and you're also able to choose and create custom models with weightings that I'll show. You can see all of your channels rolled up. So you can see how social and paid search and display look under these different models. You can also dig into a very granular level, so you could see this for individual keywords, for instance. And then we provide metrics that basically tell you the number of conversions attributed to these channels under the different attribution models. And you can quickly compare them with a percent change metric that lets you see which of those channels that have the biggest change by comparing different models. So this is a very, very simple way of getting started with that process of comparing how your channels look under different models. And it can help you begin to inform those hypotheses that you can test. So I'm just going to jump over here to give a demo of this in the interface so that you can see what it looks like. Before we start, just a couple of things to take note of for the technology here. You should turn off your pop-up blockers in your browser since the demo will open up a new window. If the new window doesn't open, there'll be a launch screen share link appearing in the slide window area. Please hold down the control key on your keyboard, click on the link, and that should bypass any pop-up blockers that you have installed. So hopefully that will work for you. So I'm going to go ahead and launch my screen share here. now that we can see that there are some assisted conversions, the next place to go is into the path length report. So when I go into my path length report, I can see for the 10,000 conversions that I tracked during this period of time, how many had one step prior to conversion. This gets back to some of those earlier questions about path lengths, and then how many had multiple steps. And you can see here that 65% of conversions are actually taking place in one step. But I would actually highlight that in terms of revenue, only 50% of the revenue is coming from conversions of that type. And there's a much larger percentage, or the rest of them there, that are actually coming from multiple step paths. So that's really where you want to dig in and begin understanding, well, what's doing that assisting? And you can do that with the assisted conversions report. So what I'm able to see here is for my high-level channels, the number of conversions and the conversion value that are being provided on a last interaction basis. And then in addition, those conversions where that channel assisted but was not the last interaction. And this can begin to get very interesting when you look at something like keywords. So if I were to look at individual keywords, I may see keywords that are performing very, very well under a last click basis, or not performing as well under a last click basis, but are actually doing a lot of assisting. So what we're seeing here, for instance, is the keyword Google Bags, which somebody may be searching for but not be aware that there's the Google store where they can buy those bags. And we can see that that keyword was responsible for one conversion on a last click basis. But there were actually an additional 5 conversions where a user had searched for that and then later came back via another source. To understand what was actually going on there, you can go into our top conversion paths report. And here we can actually see, and I filtered down to see what paths were actually followed here. So you can see somebody searched for Google Store and then came back directly to my site. But then multiple other people came and searched for Google Bags and then ultimately ended up converting by searching for Google Store. So if I were looking at my keywords purely on a last click basis, I would see Google Store is responsible for that conversion, but I would have missed that the customer may have found out about the Google Store by searching for Google Bags earlier in the process. So again, this really begins to give you that insight into how are customers originally finding you, what are they doing throughout the path, and how is that ultimately driving conversions. The last piece that I'll just show here is then taking the attribution modeling tool and applying assumptions to those paths. So I can look at my last interaction model and compare that, for instance, to a linear model. And again, what's really powerful here is how quickly I can take that and look at the number of conversions or the conversion value that are attributed under these different models. So in the case of the Google Store, there's a pretty dramatic difference in the value attributed to my referrals, right? There's about 20% more revenue attributed to referrals under a linear model than under a last click model. But I can take that, and in addition to that linear model, I can actually take some of the customization capabilities that we were speaking about earlier and create those. So I could say create a time decay model, set how far back I want that time decay model to begin to decay, and then apply rules like I want to give more credit to the first position in the path. For those sources that are direct, I don't want to give them any credit because I may consider them to be navigational. For keywords that include the word Google, for instance, I may consider those to be branded keywords, and I could weight them less. And then we can even begin to tie in factors like, did the user bounce when they came? Did they actually spend time on the site? And we can give no credit for something like that. So I could take that and apply the model and then very, very quickly see how they compare. And I can do this at any level, whether it's at the high channel level or down to keywords. So I can very, very quickly see, for instance, which of my keywords would be more highly valued under an alternative model. So in this case, Android t-shirts, I may have previously thought only brought me $10 worth of revenue, but under these alternative models is actually driving significantly more revenue. So this is just a little idea of what you're able to do here. To give you a notion of what's coming next, this is meant to give you an idea of what you're able to do with these tools. We have a follow-up webinar that I'll talk in a moment that gives you kind of the nitty-gritty around what exactly you need to be doing to get set up with this and begin using it. So with that, I'm just going to switch back to the slides here real quick, and we'll go into questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Bill. That was great. We had really a lot of questions come in while you were talking. So
excellent.
We'll get to as many as we can right now, and then we'll try to hopefully follow up with a blog post to respond to some of the others that we can't get to today. And I'll also, some other questions came in for Stefan as well, so I'll try to kind of give a few for Bill and a few that both of you guys can respond to. So let's take the first one. How often should you be doing attribution? Is this something that you do yearly, quarterly, or is it a more frequent practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's different approaches to it. I think the process of deciding on an attribution model that you're going to use and stick with may be something that happens on a less frequent basis. But we do see that this process of whenever you're analyzing your campaigns, looking at how the campaigns are performing under different attribution models as something that can become a regular part of your analysis and optimization process. So, I would actually say that this type of analysis may be one of the key things that you want to look at every time you come in to evaluate how a particular campaign is performing.
Okay, that makes sense. So here's a question. I think maybe both of you guys could give a view on this. Do you typically see clients using attribution modeling to calculate lifetime values of each customer, or by channel, or to optimize spend and ROI? So maybe if Stefan can respond first, and then Bill can come in.
Well, I've got a pretty short answer, which is, that's not something that we poked at in the research, although it's a very interesting question. I didn't speak with any marketers that were optimizing against customer lifetime value, although that would, I think that's arguably something that makes a lot of sense. What we did talk to a couple who were using retention metrics for optimization, because that's going to provide a different profile. We want repeat customers, or higher shopping cart value customers, and we're going to base our model on that. Of course, that doesn't get into a full-blown view of the lifetime value, but it's a start.
And the thing I would comment on that is, right now the approaches that I was showing are really focused on individual conversions. And a lot of decisions are made today based on looking at conversions and the channels that are driving them on a last click basis. So I think the first step is beginning to look beyond that. But there's absolutely an element to looking at conversions over time, the value of a customer, and attribution is a central part of that, because you may determine customer lifetime value, but you then need to be able to look back and see, well, what marketing activities are actually associated with that. And that's ultimately an attribution problem.
Thanks. So I see we're running a little short on time. We are going to take a couple more questions, but I would just ask the audience, if you guys, before you leave, if you could please click on the little survey link at the bottom of your console and fill out that survey. That'll help us to know what we can do better for future webinars. And we'll be sending the recording out afterwards. So let's just take as many more questions as we have time for. So here's another one. Do you think viewable impressions will provide clarity with regard to attribution, or muddy the waters further?
So from my perspective, I think viewable impressions will really, really help with that. I think one of the challenges with display impressions is that there's a lot of noise, right? And you want to look for signals, particularly for direct response advertisers, as to which display impressions actually have strong correlation with later behavior, and certainly being able to distinguish which of those impressions were viewed, or perhaps and even how long they were viewed for, I think is a really, really positive step. One of the things that we actually have in our attribution modeling tool is a way to provide weighting and credit based on the proximity of an impression to a visit. So looking at signals like that, like if an impression occurred within a short period of time before a visit, can be another type of signal. So I think that the viewable impressions piece is probably very good for attribution.
Anything to add, Stefan, or should I go for a next question for Bill?
I think we probably have time for one more, so let's move on. I would basically parrot Bill on that one.
All right. Well, thanks. So here's one that was specifically related to your demo, Bill. This person wanted to know if you can add your own models to the attribution modeling tool, or are they all built in?
Yes, you absolutely can. So as I was showing at the end there, you can take the custom model builder and create a custom set of rules. And it's based on the type of condition building that you can do in places like segmentation within Google Analytics. So there's really quite a variety of customizations that you can add there. It's pretty powerful, so absolutely.
All right, well, thanks again, everybody. I'm really pleased that Stefan and Bill were able to speak with us today, and thank you all for attending. We will be following up with an email in a couple of days with a link to the recording. If just before you leave, if you could please fill out that survey, we would really appreciate it. And thanks so much, and we hope you'll attend our next webinar, and you can click on that link or follow that link on your screen to sign up. Thanks again, Stefan and Bill.
Thank you.
You. Yep.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.